Thank you. So I'm going to say to you a number of things that will be familiar from Corinne's talk, and about the UK's approach to addressing climate change. And so our approach to addressing climate change is driven by the UK's Climate Change Act. This is one of the very first pieces of climate change legislation globally, passed in 2008. And it does four things. It's about the need to set a goal. So it sets the 2050 emissions target, but it also requires the government on adaptation to produce a national adaptation programme, and that national adaptation programme sets a vision. It's not as effective as a target, as I'll come to later, but at least it's a starting point. It then says there needs to be a pathway to deliver that target, and we, like France, we have 5-yearly carbon budgets. And in the equivalent, the nearest equivalent to that it sets for adaptation is that we have a 5-yearly climate change risk assessment which identifies the most urgent risks from climate to the UK. It then says the government must provide the toolkit for delivering the goal and the pathway. So it requires the government to deliver policies, and the current policies we have is that we have a carbon budget delivery plan, which the government has put forward, which is aimed at delivering the target, and also a national adaptation programme to deliver adaptation. And then to make sure the government is doing this, it puts in place a monitoring framework, and the most critical part of that monitoring framework is it establishes the Climate Change Committee, which is the equivalent of Corinne's Haute Conseil. So the Climate Change Committee is made up of a mitigation committee, which is chaired by Professor Piers Foster, and is made up of independent experts who will be economists and scientists and engineers and behavioural scientists. It establishes an adaptation committee, which I chair, which similarly is made up of independent experts, and a secretariat, which is led by Chris Stark, who is sitting over there and will be talking to us later this afternoon, and is a secretariat made up of a group of extremely bright analysts. And it does analysis in a wide range of sectors, now both for adaptation and mitigation. It provides advice and scrutiny, and it looks at all sorts of cross-cutting issues, including, as Corinne pointed out, things like the just transition, but also the international circumstances. So it spends its time doing modelling and research, but also getting research done by others. It provides advice on targets and on policy. It monitors progress, and it does engagement, particularly with Parliament, but also with industry and the wider public. So let me start by talking about the approach to mitigation, and indeed where we've got to. So you will see some very familiar things to the things that are being done in France. So we have 5-yearly carbon budgets. We have already met the first 3 carbon budgets, so up to the mid-2020s. We're now on to the 4th carbon budget. So at the moment we have 6 carbon budgets are legislated. There is a requirement for the government to legislate a carbon budget every 5 years. And at the moment, the analytical team is preparing the recommendations for the 7th carbon budget, which will take us into the early 2040s. So the 5th carbon budget takes us to the mid-2030s. That is the one which is also the UK's NDC, the nationally determined contribution, the commitment made at the COP. So that's a particularly critical one for the two recent COPs. So how are we doing? Well, as you can see, we started with much higher emissions than France, and that's partly because we started with an energy system that ran very much on coal. So you had the advantage of a system running with a lot of nuclear. So we have come down to the 3rd carbon budget. So far we've met the carbon budgets. That's been partly due to luck. If you remember, around 2007-8, we were I shall say, lucky enough to have a severe recession, which reduced our emissions and enabled us to meet that carbon budget. And indeed, around the third carbon budget, we have also been lucky enough to have had COVID, which of course decreased our travel and our industrial activity, and so we met the third carbon budget with some headroom to spare. If we had not had those events, I think we might be looking at a different picture. So we cannot feel too self-satisfied, I think, with our progress so far. The yellow dotted line shows you the government's carbon budget delivery plan, and it shows you that we expect just to meet the fourth carbon budget if they can deliver all their policies. But as we get out to the sixth carbon budget, things are looking rather more challenging because there is quite a big drop in emissions needed for that. So where do these emissions reductions come from? Well, of course, COVID has made the picture very confusing for the last 2 years. So I show you the data to 2018 because this is where the trends are most easy to discern. And you can see the red line, which comes down very sharply after about 2012. The red line is our electricity system. And if you go back to 1990, we still had coal on the system. We will have taken all the coal off our system by the end of 2024, and we are replacing that by rapid growth in solar and wind, particularly offshore wind. So as you can see, most of our reduction in emissions to date have come from reductions in the power sector. The central blue line and the central orange line look very much like the French data. The blue line is surface transport, so that's cars, vans, lorries. The orange line is buildings, so that's for us gas heating in our homes. Those lines are moving very slowly, and we need to get those turning down towards zero much more rapidly. And the brown line, which runs through the red line, is the reduction in industrial emissions. In the early years, that was indeed some impact of deindustrialization. In later years, it's been more energy efficiency, but also some change in the nature of industry in the UK. But as you can see, we have, like France, we have a long way to go in order to get down to net zero by 2050. And indeed, this emphasises from the report we gave to government last year, this emphasises just how far we have to go and how much we have to accelerate. And again, a very similar picture to the one that Corinne gave you. If we look forward and backwards, if we look forward to our target for the COP, our NDC, at 2030, if we look forward 8 years and backwards 8 years, and we look at the rate at which we have been reducing our emissions, then it's been about 2.9% a year, so just under 3% a year. In order to meet our nationally determined contribution and our fifth carbon budget, we will need to double that rate of reduction of emissions. So, like France, we need, I think Corinne said, you needed a doubling of the rate of reduction of emissions. It's like France, it's different across different sectors. But critically for the UK, we have been so dependent on power for reducing our emissions that if I take electricity out of this picture, so if we look at this without the benefit of decarbonising our electricity system, then we've only been reducing our emissions in the rest of the economy by about 1.2% per year. And going forward to 2030, actually we now need to multiply the rate of emissions reduction by 4. And I think Corinne highlighted you have some areas in France where you need to get to a multiplier of things like about 4. So we are in, I think, quite a similar position. We, in a way, have had the advantage in the UK that we had an electricity system that needed decarbonising, whereas France, with so much nuclear, has not had kind of the same opportunity to reduce emissions easily. And another way of looking at that is to say that up to close to the present, almost all of our emissions reduction have come from technology change that have not required people to change their behaviour. So very little of what we've seen so far has involved different behaviour and different actions by us. So decarbonising the electricity system really doesn't affect people very much. As we move forward, 60% of what we need to achieve requires society to be properly engaged and prepared to change decisions they make in their homes, decisions they make about their travel, things like that, absolutely crucially. So we cannot rely just on that kind of non-engaged population just being given low-carbon technologies. People really have to be much more engaged if we are going to make this work moving forward. So just on the mitigation side, just finally I'll say a few words about the report last year, the most recent progress report, the committee's view of where the government is going in terms of meeting its carbon budgets. And as you can see, the assessment of the policies to meet the fourth carbon budget are that there are, in general, the plans to meet the carbon budget are pretty credible, so quite likely to meet it, although the plans to meet the government's own carbon budget delivery pathway target, half of them are still have a level of uncertainty. If we move forward to the fifth carbon budget, only about half of the plans are relatively low risk or credible. And as we move forward to the sixth carbon budget, again, there is a large area where there are not yet strong plans in place. So we really do need further action and focus from the government. And the type of analysis that the committee does shows you in detail for each sector what is going well, what is close to being on track, and where there are real significant needs for more attention. And as you can see, surface transport and energy supply are in the best condition, but in terms of buildings, industry and agriculture, there are some really serious areas that need considerable amount of further attention if we are going to meet our carbon budgets going forward. So that's the picture of mitigation, and has many similarities to the story that you have just heard about what you're doing here in France. I'd like to spend the last few minutes talking to you about adaptation, and I wish I could say to you that the adaptation story was as robust as the mitigation one. In mitigation, we have a very clear target for 2050. We have those carbon budgets, those numerical carbon budgets. In adaptation, we have a vision. A vision is very hard to measure progress towards. We don't know what the government means by having a country that is fully adapted to climate change. Does that mean that nobody will die from very hot weather in the summer? Does that mean you will never find there is a hosepipe ban and you are not allowed to water your garden? Does it mean things will continue just as they are today? We don't know what the government means by fully adapted, so it's very challenging for my committee to monitor progress towards a vision. So what we would like is the government to put into its adaptation planning a set of specific standards and targets, so that we could say the government is committing that people will be resilient to a 1 in 100-year flood or a 1 in 100-year drought, sort of something that we can actually measure, and people know what it is they can expect, what protection, what level of protection they can expect. So every 5 years, we support the government in producing a climate change risk assessment. We cover 61 areas of risk and opportunity, because we are starting to grow grapes for champagne in the UK. But unfortunately, as you can imagine, the opportunities do not outweigh the risks. So we look at 61 areas of risk and opportunity. And in the last assessment in 2021, 54 of those areas of risk were rated with high urgency, so action was required. I'm not expecting you to read them, I just want you to recognize that there is a lot of red on this chart. And the other thing we particularly strongly noted was that if we compared the second climate change risk assessment in 2017 with the third one in 2021, we could see that fewer risks were in the category of keeping on doing what we're doing today or just keeping a watching brief, and more of the risks had moved into this category of more action needed now, so urgently needing addressing. So I think the very strong message from that actually in the UK risk is increasing. The rate at which we are adapting is not keeping up with the rate at which the climate is changing, and of course other things like the growth in population and people that, in some areas, people's increasing exposure to those risks. So we really, a clear message that we really need more action in the UK. And given that we are quite kind to our government, we said, well, we recognise it's hard for the government to respond to 61 risks and opportunities. So we said, we'll give you some advice on what we think are the priorities. So we gave the government back in 2021 8 priority areas. And those priorities were on the basis of the urgency of the risk, but also on the basis of what policy we knew the government was intending to bring forward in the next few years. So the first 4 of these risks relate to nature and climate. And the reason for the enormous urgency of these was that having come out of the European Union, we had the opportunity to replace the common agricultural policy support to our farmers with some other kind of support that had a much stronger focus on the environment and on climate change and on adaptation. So the government had committed to replace the common agricultural policy with the environmental land management scheme, and this was going to be part of an agriculture bill that it was bringing into the Parliament. And so we were pushing very hard to say that agriculture bill, that environmental land management scheme, must address issues like rewarding farmers for improving soil quality to make it more resilient to flooding and drought and the changes the climate will bring about. It must ensure that farmers are entirely aligned with restoring natural carbon stores, growing trees, providing natural flood protection in river catchments and things. So that was the reason for the first 4 things on the first 4 pieces of advice we gave them in terms of priorities. The next one was the risk to supply chains, particularly food supply chains. And we have, of course, seen a number of challenges in the UK where in our supermarkets we have had shelves empty of tomatoes and salad because of very hot and dry conditions, particularly in Spain. We saw problems during COVID with empty shelves in our supermarkets. Not a climate problem, but just a reminder to the government of how sensitive our supply chains are to what happens overseas. And of course, we are seeing shortages in our supermarkets again associated with both the war in Ukraine and also now with the war in Gaza and its further consequences. So we're really getting the government to think about the security of supply chains and climate impacts. We also wanted them to think, and I think Corinne mentioned this, how adaptation and mitigation knit together. In order to decarbonise our electricity system, we will be, and to decarbonise many of the other things we do, like transport, like heating in our homes. We have a huge expansion of the electricity system in the UK between today and 2050. That means by 2050, households will be increasingly reliant on electricity. They will rely on it for lighting and heating and cooking and transport and communications and just about everything they need to do. If they have no electricity, they will find it very hard to function. So we had a very strong message to the government that while we are building this new electricity system, we must build resilience in. We cannot have the situation we have just had in the winter with 3 storms coming through where we have had tens of thousands of people with no electricity for several days. 2 years ago, we had people in Scotland with no electricity for a week. By 2050, when everything we do relies on electricity, that will be a totally unacceptable situation. So we must build resilience in from the start as we design this new electricity system. As Corinne mentioned, we also suffer from high temperatures in the summer, particularly as actually we are much less well prepared for them than you are in France because they're much less usual for us. So we have seen significant increases in deaths over the past 2 summers. In fact, I think last summer we saw 4,000 excess deaths from the very high temperatures in the summer. So we need to be building homes that stay cool in the summer, something we typically haven't done in the UK. But we also need to make sure that our hospitals can function in really hot weather. Last summer, we had the experience that the largest hospital in London, which serves millions of people, had 2 data centres which both overheated and shut down, leaving that hospital running on paper-based systems for all of its patient appointments, for all of its x-rays and other scanning imaging. So thousands of appointments were cancelled, and I'm sure lots of very important data was lost for people. So we need to be prepared for heat, and we need to recognise that though we are an island, climate change overseas has enormous impacts on us. And for example, we need to be making sure that our development aid programme is supporting countries overseas who are experiencing much worse impacts of climate change than we are, is really supporting them to adapt, and that we are putting more money into supporting adaptation overseas. So those were the urgent things we asked the government to look at. But of course there are a lot of other things that needed to be thinking about as well. This is our most recent assessment. Like the mitigation committee, my adaptation committee did a progress report for the government in 2023, and this is the conclusions that we came to. So we look right across the economy and life in the UK. The inside rings are about whether the government has the right sort of policies and plans in place, and the outside rings are about whether those policies and plans are being delivered and whether that implementation is making a difference to the resilience of the nation. And I think, as you can see, the inside rings in most areas are starting to move from red to orange, and in some cases we are even seeing small areas of green. So we are making some progress in terms of policies and plans, but we are not yet seeing that those policies and plans are being properly implemented, and indeed in many cases where the areas are black, we don't yet have the data, and the government is not collecting the data for us to know whether progress is being made. So insufficient progress in making the UK more resilient, even though we are starting on that first step of developing more in the way of policies and plans. And just finally, since it is quite challenging to assess progress in adaptation, I thought we'd give you some insight into how we do that. And it's quite similar the way we do it for mitigation, except that it has rather less numbers in it, which is, I said, our frustration in adaptation. So we identify what we think is the government's objective, and that is that everybody should have, in the case of water, a plentiful supply of water. And we then look at the things you can do to try and improve that, so reducing demand, improving the system performance, so increasing leakage, increasing supply, so more reservoirs being built. We haven't built any reservoirs in the UK for about 40 years. Interdependencies, so what might stop the water system from functioning, so what are the interdependencies, for example, with the electricity system, and is the electricity system resilient to climate change such that the water system can depend on it? Do we have the data? Can we look at demand reduction data? Are we seeing the funding and investment going in? Are we seeing the public being engaged to understand how they can use less water? So all of those things are things we classify as delivery and implementation. And then legislation, regulation, standards, financial instruments and things are the things we classify as policy and plans. So that's the way we look at making our assessments of whether we are making progress on adaptation. And as you've seen, at the moment, the results are not yet very positive, although we have taken some small steps. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.